family had a word for everything I did that made them uncomfortable. They called it making things complicated. When I passed the CPA exam on my first try at 24, my mother told her friends I was good with numbers. When I made senior associate at the firm 2 years later, my brother said I'd gotten lucky with the right clients. When my father died and left a will that didn't match anything he'd ever told me in private, and I said so out loud at the kitchen table, that was me making things complicated again. My father was a quiet man who kept his promises. He grew up in Akron, worked 30 years in commercial real estate, and retired with enough to be careful about. He wasn't wealthy in the way people throw that word around, but he owned the house outright, had 2 investment accounts, and had put money aside the way people from his generation did, steadily, without talking about it. He told me once, when I was maybe 19 and home from college for Thanksgiving, that he wanted things split fairly between my brother and me. He said, fairly. He used that word specifically. I remember because he wasn't a man who wasted words. My brother is 4 years older than me and has been the family's golden child for as long as I can remember. He's charming in the way that reads as confidence until you know him well enough to see it's something else. He can walk into a room and make everyone feel like the most important person there. And then, when the room is empty, you realize he got everything he wanted, and you're not quite sure how. My parents adored it. My father called it people skills. My mother still does. I went into accounting because I liked things that were either right or wrong. Numbers don't negotiate. An entry is correct or it isn't. A balance sheet balances or it doesn't. Growing up in a house where the truth was always subject to interpretation, there was something deeply comforting about that. I moved to Cincinnati for work, kept my head down, built a career. I came home for holidays, smiled at the right moments, and didn't push back when my brother made jokes about me being all spreadsheets and no personality. It wasn't worth it. It never was. Then my father had his first stroke, and everything shifted. He recovered enough to come home, but he wasn't the same. He got tired easily. His handwriting changed. He needed help with things he'd always handled himself. My brother moved back into my parents' house to help out, which I thought was generous, until I started noticing small things. Dad's financial mail stopped coming to the house. My mother seemed confused about account balances she'd always known. When I asked questions, my brother would answer before my father could, smiling, steering the conversation somewhere else. My father died 14 months after the stroke, on a Tuesday morning in March. I drove home that night. The funeral was small and quiet, the way he would have wanted. My mother was holding herself together by sheer habit. My brother stood at the door greeting people with that handshake he had, the one that made everyone feel handled. 3 days after the funeral, we sat at the kitchen table to hear from the attorney. The will was read. I want to say I saw it coming, but I didn't. Not exactly. I knew something felt wrong, but I hadn't let myself go further than that. The will left the house to my mother, which made sense. It left the 2 investment accounts, one to my brother entirely. One to my brother entirely. My name appeared once, near the bottom, attached to a bequest of my father's watch and a set of his woodworking tools. That was it. My mother touched my hand across the table. She was crying. I don't think she knew. But my brother didn't look at me once during the whole reading. He kept his eyes on the attorney, very calm, very still. I asked to see the document afterward. The attorney handed it over without comment. I sat in my father's old armchair and read every page. The signature was my father's name. The handwriting was not my father's handwriting. I knew his signature. I'd seen it on checks, on birthday cards, on the form he'd co-signed when I took out my first lease. I'd watched him sign his name hundreds of times. The pen pressure was different. The loop on the capital letter was closed where his always opened. The date was written in a format he never used, month spelled out, year in full, when he'd always written dates numerically, the way people from his generation did automatically. I sat with that for a long moment. Then I put the will down, thanked the attorney, and drove back to my hotel room. I didn't say anything at dinner that night. My mother made the kind of food people bring when someone dies: casseroles, a fruit tray, rolls in a foil pan. My brother poured wine and told a story about our father that made everyone laugh. I watched him across the table, and I thought about what I knew and what I could prove, and those were two different things. Back in Cincinnati, I called a colleague at the firm who specialized in estate litigation. Not to hire her, just to talk through what I was looking at. She listened, asked a few questions, and then said something I already knew but needed to hear out loud. She said, if the signature is forged, the whole document is void. And if it's void, you go back to the prior will or to intestate law if there isn't one. I told her I was a CPA, not an attorney. She said that was fine, but I should find one. I also contacted a document examiner, a forensic one. I found her through a referral from our firm's legal department. She'd worked on a tax fraud case we'd supported. Her name was Dr. Whitfield, and she had 20 years of experience in question document analysis. I mailed her a copy of the will and 3 samples of my father's genuine signature, his driver's license renewal from 2 years prior, a letter he'd written to me when I graduated, and a check he'd sent me for my birthday the year before. I included a note explaining the situation and asked for her professional opinion. Then I waited. My brother called twice that week. The first call was pleasant, checking in, asking how I was holding up. The second call was less pleasant. He'd heard through my mother that I was asking questions. He said he understood I was grieving, that this was hard for all of us, but that Dad had made his wishes clear, and he hoped I wasn't going to make this harder than it needed to be. I told him I was just trying to understand everything. He said he thought that was a good idea and suggested we get lunch soon. I said sure. We both knew we weren't getting lunch. My mother called the same day. She didn't ask about the will. She asked if I was eating, if I was sleeping, if I was okay in general. She said my brother was worried about me. I told her I was fine. She said she loved me. I said I loved her too. I meant it. I also didn't tell her anything. Dr. Whitfield's preliminary report came back 11 days later. She wrote in the kind of careful, precise language that court documents require. Qualified language, probability ranges, documented methodology. But the conclusion was clear. The signature on the will showed significant inconsistencies with the known exemplars. She noted 7 specific points of divergence. She wrote that in her professional opinion, the questioned signature was not produced by the same individual as the known samples. I read that sentence 4 times. Then I printed it, put it in a folder, and called an estate attorney. His name was Mr. Beckett, and he'd been handling estate litigation in Ohio for 26 years. He was the kind of man who spoke slowly because he'd learned that speed and accuracy don't always travel together. He reviewed what I had, the will, the forensic report, the signature samples, and he didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he said, "This is a strong foundation." He explained what came next. We would file a will contest in the probate court. We would formally challenge the validity of the document on the basis of forgery. The court would appoint an independent examiner to review the evidence alongside Dr. Whitfield's report. There would likely be a hearing. He also said, "Your brother is going to come at you. He always does in these cases. Expect character attacks. Expect to be called unstable, difficult, motivated by greed. They'll say you're manufacturing this because you feel overlooked, because you were always the problem child, because you couldn't accept your father's real wishes. None of that will be true, but it'll be said." I told him I'd been called difficult my whole life. I was used to it. He almost smiled. "Good," he said. "That helps." What I wasn't prepared for was my mother. She called a week after the contest was filed. Not angry. She doesn't do angry. Not directly. She was hurt, and she let me hear it in every word. She said she didn't understand why I was doing this. She said my father loved me, and she didn't want his memory turned into a legal fight. She said my brother was devastated. She said the family was already hurting and I was making it worse. I listened to all of it. I didn't argue. I said, "Mum, I love Dad too." I said, "I'm not trying to hurt anyone." I said, "I need you to trust me." She said she was trying. Then she said, "Your brother told me you've always had trouble accepting that he was more like your father." I was quiet for a moment. I said, "That's not what this is." She said she hoped so. After I hung up, I sat at my kitchen table with my coffee going cold and thought about how a family becomes two different versions of the same story. On their side, I was the difficult one, the one who couldn't let things go, who was turning grief into a lawsuit because I couldn't accept reality. On my side, there was a forensic document examiner with 20 years of experience and 7 documented points of divergence. One of those versions was in a folder in my attorney's office. Mr. Beckett had warned me about the character attack. It came from my brother directly, through a letter from his attorney. The letter said I had a history of financial disputes with family members, which was a reference to an argument we'd had 6 years ago about splitting the cost of our parents' anniversary party, which I had apparently been holding a grudge about ever since, according to this letter. It also said I had shown erratic behavior following our father's death consistent with complicated grief, and that my accusations were the product of emotional distress rather than credible evidence. I read it standing at my kitchen counter. Then I forwarded it to Mr. Beckett, who wrote back 2 words: expected, good. The independent examiner appointed by the court was a retired FBI document analyst. He worked out of Columbus and had testified in over 200 cases. He reviewed the will, the known samples, and Dr. Whitfield's report independently. His findings aligned with hers on 6 of the 7 points. He also noted something she hadn't. The ink composition on the signature line was different from the ink used elsewhere in the document, suggesting the signature had been added separately from the rest of the text. Mr. Beckett called me when he got the report. His voice was measured, but I could hear something underneath it. He said, "This is now a very strong case." The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in May. I drove to the courthouse in my father's hometown, parked in the same lot where I used to wait for him to pick me up after school. The building was beige brick with a parking lot that needed repaving and a flagpole out front with a flag that looked newer than everything else. My brother was already inside. He was wearing a dark suit and sitting with his attorney, a man who kept touching his tie. My mother was beside him, hands in her lap, not looking at the door when I came in. I sat across the aisle. Mr. Beckett set his files on the table. He didn't look anxious. He never looked anxious. My brother's attorney went first. He talked about family grief, about competing interpretations of a dying man's wishes, about how my father's health had affected his handwriting in his final months, and how that explained any irregularities. He was smooth, well-practiced, the kind of voice that fills a room without raising the temperature. Then Mr. Beckett stood up. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't perform. He placed the forensic report in front of the judge and walked through each of the 7 points methodically. He placed the FBI examiner's findings beside them. He introduced the ink composition analysis. He showed the 3 genuine signature samples on the courtroom screen and placed the contested signature alongside them. He said, "The evidence does not require interpretation. It speaks for itself." My brother's attorney objected twice. Both times, the judge overruled him without elaboration. My brother sat very still. He had been very still the entire time, the way people are when they've run out of moves but don't want anyone to see it yet. The judge asked my brother's attorney whether his client wished to address the ink composition findings specifically. His attorney said they believed it was consistent with document handling over time. The judge said, "I see." He made a note. He didn't say anything else for a moment. When he spoke again, he was looking at the report, not at either table. He said, "The court has reviewed the forensic evidence submitted by the contestant, corroborated by an independent court-appointed examiner. The findings are specific, documented, and consistent. The prior analysis offered by the respondent does not account for the ink composition variance or the divergence in 7 identified characteristics." He paused. He said, "This court finds the submitted will to be invalid on grounds of forgery. The document is hereby voided." My brother's hands, folded on the table in front of him, went very still. His attorney was already leaning toward him, whispering. My mother made a small sound I couldn't identify. The judge continued, In the absence of a valid will, the estate will proceed under Ohio intestate succession law. The court will appoint an administrator. All assets are frozen pending the administration process. He looked at the room over his glasses. He said, "The court also notes that the evidence of forgery has been referred to the county prosecutor's office for review." That was the part that made the room quiet in a different way. Not the held breath quiet of a tense moment, but the dropping floor quiet of consequences becoming real. My brother looked at me then. It was the first time he'd looked directly at me since I walked in. I didn't look away, but I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. Everything that needed to be said had been entered into the record. Outside the courthouse, Mr. Beckett walked beside me to the parking lot. The sky was overcast, the kind of grey that makes midday feel like early evening. He said, "The intestate process will take some time. You understand what to expect?" I said I did. Under Ohio law, with my mother still living, the estate would be split. A portion to her, the remainder divided equally between my brother and me. It wasn't what my father had actually said he wanted at that Thanksgiving table 20 years ago, but it was fair. That word again, the one he'd used. My mother found me before I reached my car. She looked smaller than I remembered. She'd always been small, but grief does something to people. Takes up space that used to belong to them. She didn't say she was sorry. She said, "I didn't know." I believed her. I believed it since the beginning. I said, "I know, Mom." She said, "He would have been so angry." I said, "I think so too." She reached out and touched my arm, just briefly, and then she walked back to where my brother was standing with his attorney, both of them on their phones. She didn't look back. I drove home on the highway with the windows cracked, the kind of May air that's still making up its mind. I stopped for gas outside Dayton and sat in my car for a few minutes eating a granola bar I found in the glove compartment, the radio on low. I didn't feel triumphant. I'd read enough about contested estates to know this was the beginning of a process, not the end of one. The prosecutor's referral could go anywhere or nowhere. The administration would take months. There would be paperwork and valuations, and probably more attorneys. But something had been put into the record that couldn't be taken back out. My father's actual signature, the forgery, the 7 points, the ink. All of it, time-stamped and filed and part of a court's findings now. My brother called that evening. I let it go to voicemail. He didn't leave one. A few weeks later, the county prosecutor's office contacted Mr. Beckett. They had reviewed the referral and were opening a formal investigation. My brother was notified. His attorney filed a response. The process, as Mr. Beckett liked to say, continued. I went back to work. I had a quarterly review due, 3 client files that needed attention, and a new associate I was supposed to be mentoring. Life doesn't pause for the things that should pause it, and after a while you stop expecting it to. My mother and I talked on the phone every Sunday. It took a few weeks before those calls felt like they used to, before the weight of everything lifted enough that we could talk about ordinary things again. She mentioned that she'd started a grief support group at her church. She said it helped. I said I was glad. She didn't mention my brother much. When she did, it was brief, factual. He'd moved out of her house. He was dealing with legal things. I didn't ask for details. One Sunday, she said, out of nowhere, "Your father used to say you were the one he never had to worry about, not because you were easy, but because you knew how to find your footing." I held the phone against my ear and looked out the window of my apartment. Cincinnati in June, leaves out, the street below quiet on a Sunday evening. I said, "I didn't always feel that way." She said, "I know, but he did." We were quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that holds something rather than hiding it. The estate was finalized 7 months after the hearing. My brother entered a plea agreement with the prosecutor's office on a charge of will forgery, a 4th-degree felony under Ohio law. He was sentenced to 18 months of probation, a fine, and was ordered to pay restitution from his share of the estate to cover legal costs. His portion was reduced accordingly. Mine wasn't. I didn't go to his sentencing. There was nothing I needed to see there. Mr. Parf, Beckett sent me the summary by email, and I read it at my desk between a client call and the staff meeting. That night, I made dinner at home. Nothing special. Pasta, the kind of meal you eat standing at the counter when you're tired. I kept thinking about what my father would have said if he'd known. He was not a dramatic man. He probably would have shaken his head and said something quiet and precise, the way he did when things turned out badly because someone had been careless with the truth. He would have called it a shame. He meant it when he used that word, not a performance of disappointment, actual sorrow that something had been wasted. I kept his watch on my desk at work. It had been in the will, even the fraudulent one. I suppose my brother hadn't thought to take it. It wasn't valuable in any way that would show up on an estate inventory. It was a Seiko, analog, the kind with a date window at 3 o'clock. My father had worn it every day for 20 years. The crystal was scratched. I didn't wear it. I just kept it there where I could see it. That was enough. Some mornings I'd come in early before anyone else and sit with my coffee in the quiet of the office. The monitors off, the building still, just the hum of the HVAC and the faint sound of the city starting up outside. I'd look at the watch and think about fairness, about what the word actually meant, not as a feeling, but as something you could demonstrate, document, defend. I'd spent my career in a field built on that premise. Numbers either reconcile or they don't. A signature either matches or it doesn't. Truth isn't negotiable just because the people involved are family. My father knew that. I think that's why he said fairly that Thanksgiving instead of anything else. It was precise. It was the right word. I kept finding my footing, the way he apparently always believed I would. One day at a time, one file at a time, one clearly documented truth at a time. That was enough. It always had been.